I want to start off by admitting that I'm not a fan of Calvinism. I'm not a fan of Calvinism because of the picture or of God that it paints and of his character. But at the same time, Calvinism addresses some issues that are not possibly thoroughly addressed by Arminianism. And so you have these two things about free will and God's sovereignty, and they reconcile it all the way in favor of God's sovereignty. And then there might be others who reconcile it all the way in terms of human free will. And in theology, that represents a tension. A tension is two things, both of which are true, but they seem like they're in conflict. And that's a tension. For example, the one I like to use is God is ultimately merciful and he's ultimately just. How can he be both? That's a conflict. Well, the conflict is resolved. The tension is resolved in Christ. Christ resolved the tension of how God can be ultimately merciful and ultimately just. And I think it's going to be the same thing because I have Christ-centered theology. The Christ-centered model for early Genesis is driving me to say a lot of these things that I'm saying. But you've got human free will versus God's sovereignty. How are they resolved? They're resolved in Christ. And I'm going to show you how, I believe, as we progress in this video. Not in this video going through the scriptures one by one and proving my case, because that would be extremely lengthy. And I do that piecemeal in these other videos and, of course, in the book. If you want to subject yourself to that kind of punishment, to read a dense 400-page book that has a Christ-centered view of early Genesis and is sort of the key to unlocking this whole Christ-centered theology, then you could read that. But you shouldn't have to read it because, again, it is written at a level that maybe is beyond most people's level of interest, and it's a difficult reading level on not scholarly difficult, not difficult just to be difficult like some of these theologians do. But you do have to stop and think about it. And so we have, in Calvinism, they would say, well, look, it's all about God being sovereign, so he chooses who's saved, and he chooses before the foundation of the world. If you go to hell, it's because he chose you to go to hell. And if you go to heaven, it's because he chose you to go to heaven. And just believing that puts you in the club. Just believing the tulip and the certain things about God puts you in that club. And so they if someone is insecure, which we should all be insecure if we're thinking our works get us into heaven. That's no basis for any security. So in a way, it kind of relaxes people in their, are my works good enough? Well, that's even the wrong question. The answer should be no, your works are not good enough. Calvinism lends people to say, well, my works are good enough as long as I'm in the club, and therefore I believe these things. And God picked me to go to heaven, he picked you to go to hell. And it's for people that have control issues, it is a good thing. And I know I'm being very negative here, but Calvinism does answer some questions that deserve to be answered, and most Arminian theology is not well thought out enough to answer those questions. So there's a reason why some smart people are drawn to Calvinism. But there's also, so I don't want to overgeneralize, but there's also, Calvinism also, I might say, ministers to a couple of problem personality traits that is something, it shouldn't be done. Those things should be crucified. They should be, through the grace of Jesus Christ, overcome progressively in this life and totally in the next one. So you just have to believe you're in the club, and the danger is you start having your faith in the doctrine and not in Jesus, not in his work. I'm okay. I'm eternally bound for heaven. There's nothing I can do to lose it because I believe these tenets of Calvinism. That's not what we're supposed to have faith in. You're saved by faith. You're saved by grace through faith, I should say. But tenets of Calvinism are not what you're supposed to have the faith in. You're supposed to have the faith in the finished work of Jesus. And I think Calvinism can lead to a situation where that gets turned upside down too easily. Not all the time, not maybe even the majority of time, but for a significant portion of people. With the Christ-centered model, though, there's no longer a need for Calvinism. And some might say, like Lutherans, I'm Lutheran adjacent, basically. I'm Lutheranish in a lot of my thinking. They say that it's one predestination, it's single predestination, but not double predestination. In other words, we can't say no to ourselves and yes to God without God's help. He has to enable us. We can't say yes unless He says yes in us, yes to Him. But we can still say no. We can say no to Him. And therefore, as the Lutherans put it, God is completely responsible for our salvation, and we are completely responsible for our condemnation. And that is a base position that I'm going to riff off of when I say all this other stuff that most Lutherans would not agree with. Luther might agree with more of it, but I don't think a lot of Lutherans will. I'm going to start with time and initial conditions of the universe, but I'm going to answer several questions like is predestination versus free will. But I want to start with the Christ-centered model, and I'm going to contrast it with Calvinism and go through the issues that Calvinism does address and show how basically you don't need Calvinism anymore. If you have the Christ-centered model and Christ-centered theology, starting with early Genesis, Calvinism becomes superfluous. It's not necessary to answer any of these important questions, and those questions are better answered by pointing to Jesus. So let's start with time and initial conditions of creation. Calvinism says that God created the universe perfectly. It created the universe without sin, without physical death, and that Adam, by sinning, changed the order and the nature of all of creation. And so it's not God's fault, except that God predestined that Adam would do it. See, so they either have to come up with some way to explain that, or just embrace, God created Adam knowing that Adam would sin. And so, but they basically say because God did it in the start, there was nothing bad going on. Because God's doing everything, but yet God is still in control of everything. So all this evil, He predestined it. Now, obviously, for apologetics purposes, it's really kind of hard to justify that. And so either they struggle to justify it, or they just embrace it and say, yeah, that's right. He chose me to go to heaven, you to go to hell. You can either fight God or you can join our club by believing the same thing. And that's their response. Now, the Christ-centered model says that something different. It's, just because God has sovereignty doesn't mean He needs to use His power to impose His will on every moment of time. In fact, time itself is an artificial construct. It's designed for a purpose, and when its purpose is over, we'll go to a timeless age, perhaps. There won't be time as we know it. So, time, this universe, this age, is a place where God's will doesn't have to be done every moment. It was done before. It is done outside of that realm. It will be done at the end when this creation is done. It's served its purpose. But creation represents a time and place where God's will does not have to be done. In hell, it's never done. In heaven, it's always done instantly and perfectly. But in this lower natural realm, it is not. So we pray, Thy kingdom come, Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Makes no sense for us to pray that if that is already the state of things. If that's the state of things on earth, just exactly what God wants them, there's no need to pray that prayer. But we are taught to pray that prayer. Why? Because this world is a place between heaven and hell. It's where His will can be done, but doesn't have to be done. At the end of it, it will be. Even though He's sovereign, in time He's granted a space where His will does not have to be done. And that's where we are. And creation, we would call that subjecting creation to futility. And this is talked about in the book of Romans, where God subjects creation to futility. And what most people do with typical theology, Calvinist theology, is insert Adam into that passage in Romans 8 and say, well, this is where Adam sinned and he fell, and because of that, creation was subjected to futility. But it doesn't say that in the passage. It is inserted in by theology, that things that are not actually in the text. And I make the case in the book that creation was subjected to futility early on because God foreknew things, and the whole universe is a test. In Ephesians chapter 2, it talks about how this thing is a test where God is displaying his wisdom to heavenly powers by what is going on in this realm. And so you say, well, there's injustice in this world. It is serving a purpose that is beyond this world, and it will be made right in eternity. In other words, evil is happening here for a greater good, eternal good, and our suffering, which is real and hurtful and terrible and against God's perfect will. It's not something he wants, but it's something he allows to happen in a creation where people are free to do other than his will. And creation itself is free to do other than his will. And I say free, it's not free. It's enslaved by sin. It's enslaved by the principle of futility that God subjected creation to. Maybe creation is like us. We want to do God's will, but we, like Paul himself, he said, the thing I want to do, I don't do. The thing that I do want to do, I fail to do. And I do the things that I don't want to. I'm wretched. And then he goes on to describe what happened to creation being subjected to futility. Creation's in the same state. If you read, you have to read Paul over several chapters. He uses long arguments. If you can't follow long arguments, you can't understand Paul, because he does that. So, and really, even Martin Luther, maybe many Lutherans today don't believe it, but Martin Luther believed that there was animal death and suffering before the fall, and the tree of life was given to keep Adam in a youthful, vigorous state, implying that he would not be were it not for access to the tree of life. So it's a different theology. It's a different way of looking at things. It has fallen out of favor in some circles. But the universe was already subject to futility. There was a contest going on that has to do with heavenly powers, perhaps even before this world was formed. And there's things going on with timelines that I will get into in a minute. It's more complicated than most of us can grasp, and therefore it is inappropriate for most of us to evaluate, give our little opinion on what the creator of all this universe, that is obviously so vast and beyond us, whether he's doing the right thing or not. We don't understand what's at stake here. We don't understand the issues. But if we have any question about his nature, we should look to Jesus. Because Jesus came, he showed the earthly rulers how a real king is supposed to act. He had authority, but he didn't use his authority except to heal people and to give to others, including up to and including his life. So that's how we see time differently. The days are not limited to 6 earthly days. Please see my videos about that. Conditions were not without physical death. They were not without the latent potential for sin. Adam was not morally perfect before he took the fruit. He was who he was. So was Eve. They were walking around naked and they were unashamed. Why? Because they just didn't know any better, and so they weren't ashamed. It wasn't that they weren't being immodest. It wasn't that they weren't misbehaving. It's that there was no law, and therefore there was no sin, because God had no requirements for them. Except with the garden, he introduced one requirement: do not eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Because when you eat it, that day you're going to die. And he did die, because in the Bible, death is separation, broken fellowship with God. That is death. And in his case, it led to physical death, because he was cast out from the garden and denied access to the tree. So God sees death differently. If your saintly grandmother passes away and dies physically, the Bible doesn't count her as dead. She's asleep, waiting for the resurrection. And the only way someone is dead is if their fellowship with God is broken. And if they die physically in that state, then they are eternally dead. That's how they see. So that's how the Christ-centered model sees time differently from Calvinism and initial conditions differently than Calvinism. This universe is not a realm where every particle that moves because God commanded it to move that way. It is a realm where it's not that he doesn't have sovereignty, but it's a realm where he chooses not to use it and subjects it to futility. In other words, it can do other than his will. And that permits some things. As we go on, you'll see that permits some things and explains some things. But let's go on to the next issue. The Christ-centered model is way more Trinitarian than typical Calvinist theology, because typical Calvinist theology cannot even allow any freedom for the Son. They don't allow freedom for the Son. God, and they consider it God the Father, even God the Son is acting almost robotically or mechanically. Whatever I see the Father do, that's what I do. They take that to the extreme because they say every molecule that moves in heaven or earth, it's because God wanted it to move that way, and he wanted it to move. So that doesn't even allow, not only does it not allow free will for us, it doesn't allow free will for the Son either. And it doesn't allow, really, it brings into the issue of when then God created James Smith of Peoria, Illinois, who died in 1978, to go to hell. He created him knowing he would go to hell. And there's nothing to do but embrace that, to say, yes, he did. Now, the Christ-centered model has two better answers on this question, one of which has to do with who is ultimately saved. But the first question would be God creating people knowing they would go. And I think on one level, as long as it's not 90% of the human race or what have you, I can understand why, if you're building a universe that is a test, not only for the heavenly powers and us, just for there's more going on here than this world, I can see why it's okay for God to create people as long as they were making their free choice, but he created them knowing what their choice would be. And their choice is hell. And depending on what hell is, if hell is not God personally just heaping more and more wrath on people, just torturing them because he wants to torture people for refusing him, even though he created them knowing they would refuse him, that's the way the atheists put it. And they're completely, of course, they twist everything. It's a reflection of their inward parts. They're twisted in their heart. And so they twist everything about God. That's not what hell is. That's not how it works. There's no indication that God even adds any wrath after people are sent to hell. They bring their own punishment with them in hell. And I have videos about that too. But in other words, I can see where if 1,000 saints can really bless and appreciate God more because they did not turn into what they look at Adolf Hitler in hell, and they do not want to see what he became, and they do not want to turn into that. And they thank God that he rescued them from becoming that, because absent God, they would have wound up, they may not have had the same sins, but they would have wound up in a similar condition. I can see that being a greater good, that in God's economy and also in mine, it is a morally justifiable that one Adolf Hitler is created to wind up where he belongs if it helps 1,000 saints glorify God more and from what to see what he rescued them from becoming. Now that breaks down if you in the current Calvinist doctrine, because almost everybody goes to hell. But I'm going to address that a little bit later. But what I want to address now is, the Trinity and how Calvinism can't account for the Trinity, but the Christ-centered model does, and also at the same time answers some of these apologetics questions. So Jesus, the Son, became flesh in about 2 AD, but when he ascended into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God, guess what? He still had a body. He had a body. And when he was in his body on earth, he wasn't all-knowing. He had limitations. He said, I don't know the day or the hour. Only the Father knows. He also said, who touched me? He didn't know who he healed. Someone touched him and got healed. He didn't know. Says he grew in favor and in wisdom. So, who was this figure in the Old Testament? Yahweh came down in the Old Testament, and he also seemed to have a body. And he also seemed, even though men saw him, men interacted with him, maybe not his face, but it says in the New Testament that no man has seen God at any time. So, but here was God and also the angel of the Lord, which is really just messenger, Yahweh. It's the name of God with the word for messenger. Of thee is assumed. And sometimes he acts like he's not all-knowing either. This is God the Son. The early traditions of the church said Israel thought they were dealing with God the Father this whole time, but they were really dealing with God the Son. He was the one they were interacting with. He was the one that at one point wanted to destroy them, and Moses talked him out of it. He was the one who changed his mind and let Solomon, or let David, to his son, build a temple, even though he never asked for it. He was the one who adjusted himself to his people and interacted through time. And it doesn't seem like he was omniscient. And he was also the one who formed Adam. Now, as God the Son, he formed everything. He had a hand in the formation of everything. It was all done through him and for him. It's his playground or his testing ground or whatever you want to consider it. It's his. So what I'm suggesting is, in Genesis 1:27, God created the man in his own image. The image of God created him. First, that was the heavenly man. That was the beginning of the Son stepping down, not into human form like we are now, but like human form like he is now in heaven. And he did that prior to stepping down and becoming flesh and taking on a nature like ours and battling his struggle against sin. So he did that before. So at the time he formed Adam, he may not have been all-knowing. The Father knew. The Father knew, but he turned everything over to the Son. So it's no more than like us having a child now. We hope they will go to heaven, but we don't know that. We raise them and try to guide them so that they will, but we don't know that. And this gives a better answer on Calvinism. Yes, the Father knew ultimately some would go to hell. The Son, too, as he was creating Adam, he may have known some will ultimately go to hell, but he didn't know James Smith of Peoria, Illinois, who died in 1978. I'm going to create him in such a way so that it's inevitable he goes to hell. He didn't necessarily know that. He was pulling for everybody, but they still had their free will. They had his will, they had the free will. The Father is sitting back, and he knows the future. He knows the end from the beginning. But that leads us to the question. So it answers the question of which theological system better recognizes the true nature of God being a Trinity. And that's the Christ-centered model over Calvinism. But there's another question then. Who is on that list? Who gets saved? And that's the next thing I want to look at. Another stark contrast between Calvinism and the Christ-centered approach is who gets saved, how many get saved, and how irresistible is the call. And the Calvinists would say the people that believe in Calvinism and maybe a few more Christians get saved and everyone else is in hell or the lake of fire. That's the Calvinist answer, and that's the typical evangelical answer to that question. Our group, maybe a few outside our group that are also Christians, and that's it. And that's a good answer. I think increasingly that is the answer, but there's one factor that they're not taking into account. And so one of those factors is, what about the person who would have said yes to Jesus, but he never heard the name of Jesus? He never had anything about the gospel. He had no opportunity. Or what about the person that was abused by their pastor? They had a so-called pastor, and that pastor abused them, and so they emotionally can't even consider the truth of God and the reality of God's word. In other words, there are different situations because we live in this flawed, messed up world where God's will, it's been subjected to futility, and His perfect will is not always done. It's not done like it is in heaven. So the Calvinists have no answer other than, yeah, that's the way God intended it. God intended that abused person to be so shell-shocked that they can't even consider whether he's true or not, so that He can send them into hell and torture him for eternity. And so the atheists, they grab on to that version of God, and they use Him as an excuse. But it's a gross miscaricature of the God of the Bible is the problem. But it's the God that this branch of Christianity, it's the image of God that this branch of Christianity is putting out there as true, but it's not true. And that's really the biggest problem I have with Calvinism. The Christ-centered model offers a very distinctly different answer to these questions, both the method of salvation, not the method of salvation, but I would say how irresistible is God's grace. I take the Lutheran position on that question, and which is to say, the Lutherans think the Calvinists have double predestination, that God predestines that you say yes, but He also predestines that you say no. Whereas the Lutherans say God enables us to say yes. We have free will. We have ordinary free will, but we don't have free will to truly say no to ourselves and yes to Him unless He enables us. Then we can say yes to Him. But we can also say no to Him. Therefore, our salvation is completely due to Him and His enabling, and our condemnation is completely due to us and our refusal. Now, did He still create people knowing that they would go to hell? And see my videos again about the fate of the damned and what hell is, and you can see that hell isn't God torturing them forever. They are tortured, and it's eternal, but it's not Him. They're bringing their own hell with them. Okay, that's one thing. But the other thing they're not considering, and really not just Calvinists, but a lot of evangelical theology is not considering, is, did the work of Christ completely undo the fall of Adam or not? Did the work of Christ completely undo the fall of Adam, or did it not? When it comes down to the bottom line, when it comes down to eternity, did Christ completely undo the fall? And the Christ-centered model says yes, and I'm going to explain how. But these other theologies, including Calvinism, would have to say, not really. If they believe there was no physical death before the fall and we have physical death now, then He hasn't undone it yet. And if you're going to say there's a person who would have chosen, of course they would say, well, the answer to that is God chose them all to go to hell. If there's a person who you can imagine in different circumstances they would have said yes to God, but in the life they lived they said no. The Calvinist answer to that, it's not that they don't have an answer, but their answer is very poor. It's that God intended someone who otherwise would have said yes to Him to say no and get thrown into hell. No wonder atheists mock the Calvinist God and pretend that He is the God of Scripture, when He's really just a mischaracterization of the God of Scripture. Christ-centered model, it starts with something that perhaps most Christians are not raised to accept yet, but the Bible doesn't teach that Adam was the sole founder of the human race. Go back to Genesis, it really strongly implies the opposite. Adam is a figure of Christ, and he was put into a world where people were in innocence, but they were not deathless and they were not perfect by any means. They needed to be reconciled to God. The whole creation did. But it was not going to be reconciled except through Christ. So he created this creation in need of reconciliation. His Son was the answer to that reconciliation. But there was Adam and Eve in the garden. There was people outside the garden. And they were supposed to be blessed by Adam and Eve, and they were supposed to be guided to God by Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were the first chosen people. And then, out of their descendants, Noah and his family, they were chosen. And then, out of their descendants, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Abraham was chosen. Isaac was chosen. Jacob. So, there's this pattern in Scripture where they're supposed to be the light to the Gentiles. Israel was supposed to be the light to the Gentiles. You've got Jerusalem, you've got God's people, and then the nations are blessed in them. And that's supposed to be the pattern throughout the Bible. It started in Genesis. Guess what? That's the way it's going to end up. That's the way it does end up in Revelation 21. At the end of the book, what winds up happening is exactly what God started out to do. At the beginning, there is a world that is blessed. There's God's people. They are the holy city. They are the New Jerusalem. It's all in Revelation 21, starting with verse 9, I think. And outside are the nations who walk by its light, or the nations of the saved, as it says in the King James with the manuscript they used. Who are those people? If the church is the New Jerusalem, who are the nations of the saved that are bringing their glory into it? Per the Christ-centered model, the work of Christ completely undoes the work of Adam. The fall of Adam is completely undone by the work of Christ. Therefore, even time is healed. Even time is healed. So that, yes, those who, despite the fact that this is a fallen creation, despite the fact that we live in a world where all these terrible things happen that would separate men from God, both within our hearts and within others' hearts and within the fabric of reality itself. Terrible things would happen, and these would tend to harden our hearts against God. But some people love God anyway and choose God anyway and recognize the truth about themselves anyway. And they are the church. And in the age to come, they are the holy city with whom God dwells. But they're not the only ones saved. They're not the only ones there. God knows who would have said yes to God in that perfect world where Adam never fell. And there's a lot more of them. It's not everybody. There are people that are cast in a lake of fire, and that's where they spend their eternity because that's where they belong, and that's who they chose to be in any timeline. But there are plenty of people that they were in a timeline that got flawed by the fall of Adam. If they were in the timeline that did not, they would have said yes to God. And they become, that through the power of Christ, their names too are written in the Lamb's Book of Life, and they are saved. Is it universal salvation? No. Is it based on them being a good Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim? No. None of that. There's only one way to be saved. There's only one name in which to be saved. It's the name of the Son. But God knows who would have said yes to that name. So basically, it's taking the Calvinist argument of God's all-knowing and God choosing, but using it to increase the number of people that are saved, not reduce the number of people that are saved. They may not be in the holy city, but they will have a life that is better than the one they have now, where they serve those in the holy city gladly. So, in conclusion, Calvinism doesn't answer, it's an attempt to answer some questions about God's sovereignty, but in that tension, what they're doing is they're just taking one side of the tension and ignoring the other. And of course, some extreme free will people do the same thing in the other direction. The truth is, there is a tension between God's sovereignty and our free will. But how is that tension resolved? By saying one's true and the other is not? No. In a tension, they're both true. That's what a tension is. God does have sovereignty, and he has given us free will. But this paradox is resolved by Christ. It's resolved by the nature of God being a Trinity, and him, the Father, remaining all-knowing, but the Son can step out of that to form mankind, and thus hope everybody is saved, but knowing that some will probably choose different. It's done by the Father not being a control freak. He's giving authority to the Son. He's letting the Son do things, but the Son only looks to the Father because the Father trusts the Son's character. So he allows this universe to bubble and do weird things, but he knows even in it, the Son will do the right thing, ultimately reconciling everything to turning out just how God wanted it in the end. He doesn't give up his sovereignty, but he cuts out time. And then, who is saved? And the number of people are saved. It's reconciled by Jesus. So the free will question and God's sovereignty question, they are a tension. But just like the question of God's mercy versus God's justice, how can he be both at once? It's resolved in Christ. I do appreciate you listening. I know this is new. It's not easy thinking, but it's thinking that elevates Jesus. It lifts up the Son of Man. And if that happens, if Christians will start uplifting the Son of Man, Jesus said, if I be lifted up, I will draw all men to myself. So let's do that, even if it means we have to change our thinking and our minds about some things. What's not important is that we're always confirmed as being right in what we previously thought about God. What's important is the Son of Man is lifted up. Thank you for listening, and may God bless you.